Welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Heather Isvaron, and with me today is Captain Matthew Cutts, Chief of Resources and Performance Management for U.S. Coast Guard Pacific Area. Welcome, Captain.
Thanks, Heather. Today
we're going to discuss the Coast Guard Ports, Waterways and Coastal Security Outcome Measures, or PWCS. And can you tell me a little bit of the history of it and what interested you in the subject matter?
The PWCS Outcome Measure has been around for about 3 years, and that's how the Coast Guard reports to Congress and our citizens the effectiveness of Coast Guard efforts to achieve maritime homeland security in our ports and waterways. And the reason that I'm interested in this measure is because, as Chief of Resources for the Coast Guard Pacific Area, I want to ensure that we apply our resources in the best way possible to achieve the highest effectiveness that the Coast Guard can.
And so that's really interesting because measuring effectiveness is really difficult sometimes. Can you tell me what most surprised you in your research?
The surprising thing that I found was that there are several models that are involved in this measure. There's the Maritime Security Risk Analysis model and the LROI model. And each of those models has an activity library, but those, while they're closely aligned, there are some differences, and those differences introduce inaccuracies into the measurement of the PWCS outcome measure. And also, we have something called Operation Neptune Shield with yet another activity library. And one of my major recommendations is to align the activity libraries of each of those 3 items so that we can do the best job possible in measuring our effectiveness.
And so when you're talking about this on a national level, what would that look like in terms of implementation?
Well, actually, right now, the Coast Guard is starting to revise our combating maritime terrorism strategy. And it's a great opportunity to bring together representatives of Op Neptune Shield, Maritime Security Risk Analysis Model, and the LROI model to make sure that our activity library for each of those 3 models is aligned, and that in doing so, we can best measure our effectiveness in achieving maritime homeland security.
Out of the recommendations that you made, what are the most important for our audience to know and understand?
Well, I think aligning those 3 activity libraries is definitely the most important. Another thing that has a major impact on the PWCS outcome measure is our level of assumed effectiveness in intelligence queuing. And that's something that the Coast Guard Intelligence Coordination Center is going to look at for us because it has such a major impact on that outcome measure. Another thing that we're looking at is doing a better job of getting outside input into the LROI model, because right now we do a great job of getting Coast Guard input into the model, but we could improve our collection of data from other sources, from red cells, looking at potential avenues for maritime terrorism, from area maritime security committees that already provide some input, but we want to expand that input so we get more than one viewpoint brought into the LROI model.
And what would you say are the most critical obstacles to overcome in achieving some of these recommendations that you're making?
Well, one of the things is making sure that we have enough funding to implement all the recommendations. That's always a concern in the Coast Guard. And the other is just getting together the people and bringing their ideas into alignment, because everybody has their own ideas about how best to do things. And bringing into alignment 3 different things, Operation Neptune Shield, the Maritime Security Risk Analysis Model, and the LROI model promises to be difficult. But it's really important that we do so because we want to do as good a job as possible assessing our effectiveness in achieving maritime homeland security.
And how would you integrate the state and local perspective into some of these recommendations?
Well, I mentioned the Area Maritime Security Committee, and each captain of the port oversees an Area Maritime Security Committee. And that is the avenue where state, local, and private entities can provide input into how the Coast Guard executes its maritime homeland security mission.
There was a recommendation based upon one of a previous student's research who was actually a detective with Long Beach.
That's correct. Candace Wright, a detective for the Long Beach Police Department, came up with an idea for a virtual maritime fusion center. And that was an avenue for state and local and federal entities and also private entities in the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach to maintain constant contact to increase maritime domain awareness and achieve synergies by operating together. One of the recommendations in my thesis is for the Coast Guard to examine how we run our home port web portal so that Area Maritime Security Committee members and others can work together better in the ports of the United States to achieve maritime homeland security.
You mentioned two models in your research. Can you go into greater depth about them and then how they tie into the bigger scheme?
The first model that my research addresses is the Maritime Security Risk Analysis Model. And you can see on the GAO Risk Management Framework, the risk assessment step is where this model comes in. And that is how each captain of the port assesses the level of terrorism-related maritime risk in their port. And then the other model in my research is the Elroy model, and that is how we calculate the PWCS outcome measure. And that is seen in the GAO Risk Management Framework in the implementation and monitoring step, where we assess Coast Guard effectiveness in managing risk in the maritime domain.
So the two models that you discuss in your research and tying that into the bigger model, is that the first time this has been done, to your knowledge?
Actually, the folks that have been working on these models have been working together for years, but to do a better job of assessing our effectiveness in maritime homeland security, there's just a need for those models to become more closely aligned.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. It sounds like you have a very robust agenda for the next couple of years, and we look forward to seeing all the great things you'll do.
Thanks very much, Heather. I appreciate it.